The planned release of Israeli hostages due on Saturday has been postponed until further notice. Let's cross to Jerusalem. Our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, joins us now. This feels like it's the biggest setback so far since the ceasefire agreement started taking place, Ali, 22 days ago.
Yeah, very much so. There have been road bumps along the way that tend to have been smoothed out and sorted out by the mediators, but this definitely does seem to be the biggest threat to derail the ceasefire so far. It comes from a statement from a Hamas spokesman. Quite a lot to sort of unpack in this because it is very significant. Now, they say...
Yes, Dr. Felipe, I am familiar. I know that the Eric Adams charges have been dropped. I know. He's a free man, okay?
They claim that over the last 3 weeks, during the ceasefire, there have been repeated violations by Israel, including delaying the return of the displaced to the northern Gaza Strip. Now, that did happen, but it happened because Israel was angry at chaotic and dangerous scenes surrounding the release of 2 Israeli hostages, Arbel Yehud and Gadi Moses, when they were surrounded by hundreds, possibly thousands of Palestinians at the moment of their release. Israel was angry by that, and they delayed the withdrawal of their forces from part of the Netzrim corridor, which in turn delayed Gazans being allowed to go north. But it did resolve itself, and Gazans can now pass from south to north of Gaza. They also say they accuse Israel of targeting Gazans with shelling and gunfire. Again, this has happened, but Israel says that it has been at times when their soldiers who remain in the Gaza Strip have felt under threat from Gazans approaching them or coming near them, and they've either fired in the air or fired at them. So there have been a couple of examples of that, but Israel defends itself in that way. And Hamas also say there's been a failure to bring in relief supplies in all their forms as agreed upon. Now, I need to go and check the figures on this. I know, speaking to a very senior World Food Programme executive here a number of days ago and he had been in and out of Gaza quite regularly over the last week or two, about how the humanitarian situation is. And I think we've heard similar as well from a British official who's now senior at the United Nations, Tom Fletcher, who's currently in Gaza, saying that the risk of famine has been averted. Hundreds of trucks are getting into Gaza. Many more.
Oh, so what are they complaining about?
The
nice
impression I was
take.
getting is that actually humanitarian aid is getting in.
Why don't you say if it's sufficient humanitarian aid, or more importantly than sufficient humanitarian aid, the pre-established number? Interesting. The reasons as to why Hamas was postponing hostage release delay was because of the many different violations of humanitarian agreements in Gaza. They were agreed upon for 12,000 aid trucks. Only 8,500 were allowed to enter. 50 fuel trucks per day was agreed upon. Only 15 fuel trucks were allowed to enter. 60,000 mobile homes were agreed upon. No mobile homes have entered the strip. They agreed upon 200,000 tents, and they only got 20,000 tents. The violations were a shortfall of 3,500 aid trucks, a shortfall of 35 fuel trucks per day, complete absence of mobile homes, and a shortfall of 180,000 tents. It's not even just that. They've also continued bombing. Israel not only did not follow through on allowing these aid trucks in, but Israel also simultaneously kept up bombing on the caravans. Here's Fox News' national chief foreign correspondent, Trey Yingst. One of the 4 key ceasefire issues right now is that of the caravans, temporary homes for Palestinians in Gaza. An official with knowledge of the talks tells me a number of countries and international organizations, including the UN and Qatar, have requested to send caravans to Gaza in accordance with the agreement. All the requests have so far been rejected without explanation, according to this official. Israel must approve for the caravans to enter. So it's not like this aid doesn't exist. This aid is ready to go. There's only one hurdle, and that is Israel. Israel does not want this aid that they previously negotiated on allowing to enter the Gaza Strip to enter the Gaza Strip. This is the reason why Hamas said, we are going to stop the hostage deal until you follow through on your end of the ceasefire conditions. We're going to postpone it. It's crazy that Israel's situation is so black and white that you have Fox News' own chief foreign correspondent, Trey Yingst, who is not exactly a friend to the Palestinians, actively, seemingly defending Palestinians, because defending Palestinians at that point is just defending the truth. What's also insane about this process is that when Donald Trump says if Hamas doesn't release the hostages, or the conditions of the hostages are horrible, and that's why I can't bear it any longer. What he's saying is we're just going to kill all the hostages. That's what he's saying. When he says we're going to take crazy action, he means like he's just going to kill them. He does not care.
In the kind of volumes that is now needed. So that would seem to undermine the Hamas claim.
Dude, this stuff is so incredibly frustrating. And it is truly wild that after 16 months have passed, the media hasn't stopped doing this even a little bit. They routinely just take the Israeli position and repeat it. No critical thinking whatsoever. No, like, hey, let me just explain what's actually going on. They rarely ever even factor in Western NGOs and their assessment, as long as it undermines the Israeli position. The New York Times is definitely the worst offender on this. I truly don't know if there is a Western outlet that is as bad as the New York Times. Like, I think, especially given its position as like the objective arbiter of the truth, quote unquote, right? The New York Times, I think, plays a much worse role overall than Fox News does even. It's really, really bad. It's like New York Post level, but it's not an expectation for the New York Times to behave like the New York Post. That's what makes it so much worse. It is genuinely frustrating because it's not even that it's like, oh, they have a pro-Israeli bias or whatever. It's just objectively untrue. Like they are doing a genuine disservice to the truth. Even Times of Israel agrees with you. What is going on, man? The Times of Israel is not an anti-Zionist newspaper. The Times of Israel is just straight up an Israeli newspaper that is pro-Israel. If you've been in here for the past 15, 16 months, you've seen me constantly rely on Israeli reporting because there is no additional reason for the Times of Israel or Ynet or especially Channel 14 to try and shelter the Israeli public from the truth because the Israeli public already has a certain position on the matter. The coverage following the Hamas attack instead focused on Palestinian suffering, portraying Palestinians as passive victims whose suffering grows daily. There was extensive coverage of the Israeli violence, but less mention of Israeli hostages, Hamas casualties, Palestinian violence. Little mention is made of Israeli casualties post-October 7 and or of Palestinian acts of violence post-October 7, even as Israel and Hamas were locked in intensive combat over the 8 months of the study period. I'm wrong in my initial assessment. It's not saying that the Times of Israel is saying that the New York Times is too pro-Israel. But this article itself, this research itself, unironically fails to understand why the New York Times, covers the story in the way that they do. They think it's because they're too sympathetic to the Palestinians. It is not. They're misunderstanding the reason why the New York Times is covering the conflict in the way that they're covering. New York Times does very different coverage on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, than even Israeli newspapers do. Because the Israeli newspapers do actually actively cover, like Times of Israel, for example, which I rely on, like Emmanuel Fabian is the name of their military correspondent. Why do I know that name? Because Times of Israel is one of the few places where you can actually actively get the names of the Israeli combatants that were slain, okay, that were killed by Hamas. New York Times rarely ever covers that stuff. And partially, the reason why they don't cover that stuff is because the American reception to what's going on in Israel and what's going on in Gaza is very different than the Israeli reception. The Israeli public will look at a story of like Israel blowing up a school and receive it very differently than the American public will look at it. You can actually showcase all of the military, all of the things that the Israeli military is doing in Israel, and they'll basically look at it and go, great, that's awesome. Also, you are tasked with showcasing the penalties that the Israeli military is incurring in Israel, and that will drum up more support for the war because Israelis look at that and go, oh, they're killing our brave soldiers. We want to do more war. But if you do that in the Western world, it comes across as a military conflict that is far too deadly for one side, that is even causing penalties for the side that is like supposed to be our allies. That's what I'm trying to explain. Something that Israelis would actually look at and get angry about or look at and cheer on is not going to be received in the same way in the Western world. The New York Times editorial staff understand this reality, which is precisely the reason why they do the coverage that they do. Yes, if the New York Times shows Hamas mounting a competent defense, then it undercuts the idea of Israel being a superior, competent military force and a powerful U.S. ally that is, fighting this righteous war. Americans don't have the same, they're not primed in the same way that the Israeli public is. They don't have the same appetite. To them, they're like, why is this foreign country using all of our money to go fight this war against children? Clearly, considering that the overwhelming majority opinion of the public, including the Republican Party even, was a ceasefire, was to immediately implement a ceasefire. That was not the majority position in Israel. Think about that. In spite of the fact that the families, the immediate family members, were consistently protesting to get a ceasefire. That's why I've stressed the importance of how Western publishers take a very different stance when they are doing pro-Israeli coverage than Israeli publishers do. Ironic, though, that this guy thinks that the New York Times was far too pro-Palestinian and not pro-Israel enough. It's even different than Vietnam, because the Viet Cong were killing American soldiers. Hamas is killing Israeli soldiers. To the Americans, they are, at best, indifferent. They don't care. These aren't Americans. They just see it as an endless money suck. We're insulated and primed for American imperialism, not another country whose imperialism we're funding. That degree of removal allows for Americans to change their level of support. I mean, think about it with Ukraine. Ukrainians, regardless of the American State Department goals in Ukraine, Ukrainians are fighting an honorable fight. They are trying to rid their borders of an invading army. And even then, think about the American appetite for funding the Ukrainian military defense. Think about that. There is very little remaining at this point. So make no mistake, Americans don't want to give money to foreign countries that want to defend themselves, whether legitimate or not. They certainly do not want to give money to another country that is dominating women and children for the most part.
Saturday in Gaza and the latest release of Israeli hostages. The three men looked gaunt and unhealthy, spurring criticism from the Israeli government of their treatment and driving greater urgency from hostage families for their captive loved ones to be released without delay. But delay is exactly what Hamas is now promising, saying next weekend's round of releases will be postponed. Hamas blames what it calls Israeli violations of the ceasefire, delaying Palestinians' return north, failures in facilitating humanitarian aid, and targeting Palestinians with airstrikes and gunfire. Yesterday, Israeli troops shot dead 3 Palestinians among a group that approached the Israeli-declared buffer zone in the north of the Strip. Israel's defense minister has called Hamas's statement a violation of the ceasefire deal, instructing the military to prepare at the highest level of readiness inside Gaza and to defend surrounding Israeli communities. Even before Hamas's announcement, Israel's prime minister was harangued in parliament by opposition members accusing him of risking the return of the hostages. He accused them of wanting to capitulate and talked up President Trump's surprise vision for Gaza's future, announced during his White House visit last week.
The historic meeting with President Trump was the most important, the friendliest, and the most significant I've ever had with an American president. And I believe that there was not a more significant meeting with any other Prime Minister of Israel.
We'll build beautiful communities for the 1.9 million people.
President Trump, meanwhile, doubling down on his plan and more. No equivocation this time. Palestinians would be displaced to Egypt and Jordan permanently.
Think of it as a real estate development for the future. It would be a beautiful piece of land.
Would the Palestinians have the right to return?
No, they wouldn't, because they're going to have much better housing, much better. In other words, I'm talking about building a permanent place for them, because if they have to return now, it'll be years before you could ever. It's not habitable.
That may be an apt description of Jabalia in northern Gaza, but one that doesn't account for the determination of its people to come back here and not to leave again.
This is impossible, impossible. No one would be willing to leave their homeland and emigrate. It is impossible. We die in our land and will not leave.
My response, I will remain in this country and on this land. If I die, I will die here and not leave Jabalia. I will not leave Jabalia camp.
In the occupied West Bank, Israeli military operations continue at an intense pace. An 8 months pregnant woman among those killed yesterday. And in East Jerusalem, a Palestinian-owned bookshop, long an institution, raided. Its proprietors arrested on suspicion of selling inciting material. This
is also insane. And one of the people that's defending this bookstore is literally, once again, Trey Yingst. Yeah, I know he said he's going to cut aid. Yeah, once again, this would undermine America and its regional plans. Trey Yingst was one of the few people that was talking about the reasons as to why the hostage negotiation is like falling apart due to Israel's refusal. And the other thing that Trey was talking about is actually he was defending the bookstore. Where is it? Let me see. As we have reported the past week, Hamas officials publicly and privately rejected the Trump administration plan to take over Gaza. Hamas has dozens of living hostages still in captivity. The hostages are the only significant leverage they have left. Hamas is listening. Israeli and American officials say once the hostages are home, all Palestinians will be forced out of Gaza to neighboring countries. Important context when you see Hamas announcement postponing the hostage release for Saturday. Israeli police raided a well-known bookstore in the American Colony Hotel in Jerusalem, arresting one of the owners and his nephew on suspicion of selling books containing incitement. The police posted a photo of a children's coloring book to support their claim. I've been to this bookstore numerous times, a very peaceful place that represents how Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side and exchange ideas. I noticed that the Israelis were always welcome when shopping there. It's bizarre that such a store would be targeted. It's not bizarre. I've never walked into a bookstore around the world and agree with every piece of content or literature. That's not what bookstores are supposed to be. Research shows that when books are banned, they tend to increase in sales. I mean, it's like still a very American attitude but again, Israeli spokesperson tells me that the bookstore owners Mahmoud and Ahmad Muna will be charged, among other things, for this book on the left allegedly containing inciting content. On the right, Netanyahu displaying the same content from the river to the sea. Yeah. I've been going to this bookshop on Salahuddin Street in East Jerusalem for decades. Unbelievable effort to stop free expression of national pride among Palestinians. Not necessarily that unbelievable if we're being real. It's very believable that Israel would do this. Yeah, I can't believe that victims of a colonial apartheid have books in it that say genocide is bad and apartheid is wrong. This is inciting fear and anger.
It's always going to be a critical period, halfway through the first phase of the ceasefire. Now Egyptian mediators quoted as saying the entire deal is at risk. Talks for phase 2 postponed, with Hamas blaming both Israel and a US president who wants to empty Gaza and whose guarantees no longer apply.
Well, with me now is Hasan Zomlot, the Palestinian ambassador to the UK. How close is the ceasefire to breaking down, do you think?
It's very wobbly, and the last few days have seen Netanyahu saying publicly that he does not want to go to phase 2. He does not want to end the war. He wants to extend phase 1, already frustrating the mediator, and it is clear-cut. Netanyahu, the Israeli government, does not want to end their genocidal aggression on Gaza, and therefore they have killed 100 Palestinians in Gaza since the ceasefire agreement and implementation. They have killed dozens in the West Bank, displaced 35,000 as per the United Nations from Tulkarem and Jenin in the West Bank. They have detained more than 580 Palestinians in the West Bank, despite the fact that they had to release few hundreds. So the situation is very clear. Netanyahu wants to find any pretext to actually not go ahead with the ceasefire agreement as it is.
So do you think Hamas has done the right thing by announcing this delay?
What we need to make sure is that Hamas and all parties involved will implement the ceasefire. Breaking this agreement is a non-option. We have got to continue on this path.
So do you say to them tonight they should go ahead and release those hostages on Saturday?
The agreement must be fulfilled and implemented as is, and we call on the mediator to do so immediately and to make sure they lean on Netanyahu, because he is unhinged and his main calculations is internal. It's very obvious. He wants to go back to his coalition, saying that he did not honor these agreements.
It's looking more clear now, since we last spoke, that Donald Trump's plan to take over Gaza and not give the Palestinians the right to return, he now says, is making things worse.
Let's not comment on what Mr. Trump says every day, and then next day he backtracks and the White House comes with.
But Hamas is blaming it.
What matters?
They're saying he's undermined the American guarantee.
The real stuff is here. What matters is that Palestine is not a real estate deal. Gaza is not for sale. Gaza should and will be rebuilt. We have all the plans for that. People must be allowed to return to their homes and stay on their land. Gaza should be united with the West Bank. An international plan that is already on its way for establishing a state of Palestine is there, and we will call on President Trump soon to help us be part of that peace, that lasting, comprehensive peace. This zigzagging will not help anybody, and let's not be distracted, Krishnan, because much of this about the mass expulsion of the Palestinians, immoral, illegal, it's impractical. It's impractical. Much of this is also distraction because, in effect, while they are talking about that real estate deal, the genocide continues. It continues in Gaza. It continues in the West Bank. We want to make sure that the mass killing and destruction stops, the agreement upheld, and we move swiftly to rebuilding Gaza, uniting Gaza with the West Bank, stopping the monstrous settlement expansion in the West Bank, bring back life to a final resolution of the conflict, bring this international momentum with us. And you've heard from Saudi Arabia, from the rest of the international community. There will be an international conference in the UN in a few months' time to actually, once and for all, implement the two-state solution. We will call on President Trump to be part of that international momentum towards genuine peace, not real estate deals.
So given what is going on in the West Bank, even now, why are there reports now that the Palestinian Authority is thinking of changing its payment system to, well, what was called the martyrs' payments? Now, the Americans used to object to it. Israel objects to it. What's going on there?
There's no martyrs' payment. There are payment for the families of those victims of the Israeli occupation. Israel kills without any accountability. We have children, we have mothers, we have families that we have to take care of. So I haven't been following the details if it just broke out, but I can assure you the families of our martyrs, of our prisoners, must be taken care of by the Palestinian government, no matter what the scheme is.
I mean, what else now can be done to get this back on track? I mean, you know, it's all very well sort of exhorting the parties. Does anybody actually have the influence or the authority now to bring them back from the brink?
Of course, if we have leadership and statesmanship, if we really know where the heart of the matter is and the root cause of all this is, it is absolutely clear in the last 2 weeks when President Trump said that he wants to inflict forced displacement of Gaza and build something for the world to come and live in, the entire Israeli class did not oppose, not just Netanyahu, all the way to the very far left parties of Israel, the opposition. There is some sort of a consensus in the Israeli public now and the political system whereby they only see one people living in the historic land of Palestine. They don't see us. They have no place for us. So the idea of ethnic cleansing, the idea of erasure now has almost the majority supporting
and book seizures.
And why I'm saying this? I'm saying this from here we move to make sure that if we believe in sharing, if we believe in international consensus, if we believe in the two-state solution, this is a time for action. London must take action, including the immediate recognition of the state of Palestine, the imposition of sanctions on the settlers, the settler organizations, and the state that sponsors these settlements, the full arms embargo, not half arms embargo. No half commitments is required, and help us, help the state of Palestine, help the government of Palestine, help.
You know, in this country.
Oh, God. Mark Levin interviewed this demon. Ay, ay, ay. All right, let's move on from this. As in, Donald Trump is going back to the hostage negotiation and saying, after spending the last week talking about how he's going to own Gaza personally and how he's not going to let any Palestinian remain there and that they have no right to return, even though they haven't left yet. They haven't been forced out yet. Now he's pulling the lever off the hostage negotiations and saying, actually, never mind. You're just going to release all the hostages and there's nothing you can do about it. And if that's not the case, all hell will break loose, which I suspect Israel at this stage is not capable of going back into Gaza on its own. I think you know what that means. You should take back the credit you gave him for stopping the war. You have to be very stupid if you think that I said Donald Trump is earnestly stopping the war. What did I tell you? I told you that this was a brief pause. I will celebrate any kind of stoppage of hostilities. Having said that, I told you consistently that he has a way more nefarious purpose behind his allegiances to Israel and that he was inevitably looking for permanent annexation of the West Bank. It's not exactly a prophetic take either. It's the obvious one. Here's Al Jazeera interviewing a Hamas official. Hamas official Bassem Naim tells Al Jazeera that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is intentionally sabotaging the ceasefire deal, continuing to block aid, kill Palestinians, and delay negotiations on phase 2.
According to all observers, including the mediators, that we have done all what we have to do along the last few weeks. But the Israelis, until now, they are still blocking the humanitarian aid. They are still shooting on Palestinians and killing Palestinians. They are threatening by returning back to war. They have, for example, they have postponed the negotiations for the second phase have to start on the day 16 of the first phase agreement. Netanyahu intentionally have postpone the start of the negotiations until he visits Washington, and he is now returning back. He sent yesterday a technical delegation, a very low-profile technical delegation, who is not authorized to negotiate anything, especially for the second phase. Therefore, until now, we didn't start the second phase negotiation, which has to be started 1 week ago. Therefore, he is intentionally planning, and he publicly stated that he is looking for prolonging the first phase and postponing the second phase negotiations. Therefore, they are violating, I think, every observer, every neutral observer will clearly see that the Israelis intentionally sabotaging the deal and undermining the agreement.
So just for the sake of clarity, and now that you're mentioning the phase 2 negotiations, are you saying that the phase 2 negotiations now are stalled?
They didn't start. We cannot talk about stall.
Incredible stuff. This will, I predict, have more dangerous consequences for internal Israeli politics, as the Israeli population has gotten a taste of hostage release, and therefore will understandably demand more, because they recognize it as the only realistic method of extracting hostages alive.